let's talk first of all about Zoom, which was rather interesting.
Yes, that was a very shocking issue there. For folks who haven't heard about it, the Zoom issue was that the Zoom video conferencing software had a bug that allowed somebody to force your webcam to turn on when you joined a meeting, even if you didn't want it to. Um, so it's that's a little bit concerning, obviously, that somebody could get a shot of you by tricking you into clicking a link and opening up a webcam, opening up your webcam. More concerning, though, was the fact that Zoom actually had a hidden process running on the machine that was running a web server, listening on a non-standard port, and it could reinstall the software even if you had uninstalled previously, just by you clicking on a link somewhere. They could trick you into clicking a link. When you visited that link, it would cause malicious code to run on your computer, which could essentially infect you with anything. Um,
And also,
so
didn't I see there was also the issue uh, there was of DDoS attacks as well?
Sure, yeah. You could potentially, attack somebody and have them, have the software just keep loading, keep connecting. So that was also a problem, and it was a big enough problem that Apple actually used their malware removal tool that's built into macOS to remove this little web server from the Zoom software. This was definitely the first time, at least as far as I am aware, that Apple used their malware handling um, portions of the system to remove a piece of legitimate software. Obviously, somebody at Apple thought that this was a severe enough problem that they needed to take action of some kind, and that
Mm.
was the action they were able to take. And I personally agree with them. The idea that there was a hidden web server on my Mac that could be used for remote code execution is extremely concerning. There are a lot of things we can detect because we're a third party. And if Apple started detecting and removing some of the things we detect, it's a slippery slope because it's essentially them telling people this is what you're not allowed to run on your Mac. I mean, anytime that there's something severe enough that it should be blocked or removed from the App Store or detected as malware, Apple will take action on that.
Right. And let's talk about the iOS ecosystem. Are there specific threats you see within the iOS ecosystem that are different to Android?
Absolutely, it's very, very different from Android. Really, the level of threats on iOS is fairly minimal. It's really at this point limited to nation state actors. I would say that the most uh, well known threat on iOS is the Pegasus spyware. It's made by a company named NSO, and it's sold to nation states for spying on whoever they may be targeting. A lot of times it's used by nation states to spy on journalists, for example, in the Middle East.
Hmm. Okay. Because it's interesting you say this because we've often talked or we've had that the old cliche that Macs don't get malware, those kind of things. Now your career rather proves that's not true.
Yes.
You've ruined the illusion for us all, Thomas.
That is true. Yep.
I
And
mean,
it
do you still, joking aside, do you still consider the Apple ecosystem to be a bit safe? Do you consider it a safe ecosystem?
I think it's safer in terms of the number of threats. For better or for worse, Windows is it still gets targeted by most malware because there are more Windows users out there.
Right.
I don't think at this point in time that Windows is really any less secure than Mac OS. In fact, in some ways, I think it's probably a little bit more secure because they've had
Right.
more years under threat to tighten it down.
Okay.
So
But that's interesting. So, do you think Apple has not taken security as seriously as it might have then?
I think they are taking it seriously, but I think that they've got less experience with it than Microsoft, and I think that I don't necessarily agree with some of the things that they have done. For example, recent changes to macOS lock down certain portions of the file system. So, for example, in the upcoming macOS Catalina release, uh, software won't be able to get access to things like your downloads folder or files that are on your desktop, um, among other places, without getting explicit user consent. The problem is that so many applications do request that consent that it becomes a problem of dialogue fatigue. So users just see this thing coming up that's preventing them from doing what they want to do, and they just click allow, no matter what. They
A
don't even
bit
read
like
it.
a bit like our approach to terms and conditions sometimes, where we just want to click yes and we don't ever read the privacy policy
Yes,
that we're meant to.
exactly. So I don't know what the right solution is for a company like Apple. I think it's a difficult problem to solve. You do want to lock down access to certain data. I respect that. I think that that's a really great idea. I just don't know that. Um, I don't know that repeatedly asking the user to allow things like that is the best choice because we know how users act with that sort of thing.
And if I looked for a variety of tools to protect my Mac from viruses, I'd find all sorts of things. What is it that? What's your approach? What are you offering?
Yeah. So we focus on a really fast engine. So a lot of scanners will take sometimes hours to run. We really focus on making sure ours is a lot faster than that. We also focus on complete removal. So we don't just focus on removing, a single file that technically does disable the malware, but leaves a lot of bits and pieces lying around for you and a lot of users don't like that. They see the stuff that's left over and it makes them concerned. Um, then we also focus on removing what we call PUPs or potentially unwanted programs. And
Every Now everyone wants pups, Thomas. Seriously.
yeah, these aren't the good kinds of PUPs.
Uh,
So these are things that use kind of tricky, scammy situations to get themselves installed on your computer. Things like they trick you into thinking you need Adobe Flash Player. You download and install it, and suddenly you've got all this crud on your machine that you didn't want. Um, so we detect and remove a lot of those things, even though they are from technically legitimate companies. Um, and that can be a little bit of a sticking point for a lot of security vendors because those companies can be kind of loud and they complain. They don't like it when we detect their stuff.
so I mean, how? What would your approach then have been to something like Zoom?
I think I probably, if I had been Apple, I would have done it the same way. I would have removed that web server component. They didn't touch anything else, which was, I think, the right way to go. From what I've heard, they also worked with Zoom. I don't know exactly how much of this was working with Zoom and how much of it was saying, "Hey, Zoom guys, you're going to stop this right now."
Well,
um,
yeah, I mean, we had two silent updates, didn't we?
yeah, yeah. So I think they handled it well. I think that was a case where they really did a good job.
Uh, and then tell us what's next. What kind of, you said you led a lot of the research as well in this space. What's the kind of next thing you're looking at?
Yeah, so we see lots and lots of adware and pups every day. A lot of times they're not particularly interesting, but they're things that we want to make sure we're detecting. We're always a little bit more interested when some new malware comes out. So, for example, we spotted some malware recently that we call Bird Miner. That's it's a cryptocurrency mining software. So it uses your computer's processing power to generate Bitcoin. And the way that it did it was kind of interesting. It actually used a Linux emulator called QEMU, thus the name Bird Miner. Um, and so it ran this Bitcoin mining software in emulation rather than directly as a process on the Mac. So we believe that was probably partially for obfuscation, so people don't notice what's going on because they don't see the Bitcoin mining software running, and partly for cross-platform purposes. It's probably something that they may have also wanted to run on Windows or Linux or other systems.
Well, I'm really grateful for you taking the time to explain it. Was there any other particular issues you wanted to highlight that you see within the Mac ecosystem?
Yeah, so we saw something really interesting recently. There was a Firefox 0-day vulnerability. So, a 0-day, for those who might be listening that don't know, it basically means a vulnerability in a piece of software that can be used for malicious purposes that was previously unknown. Lots of people covered that. It was a really, really big story. And it was used in a targeted attack against Coinbase, and we believe some other cryptocurrency companies as well. And in this attack, users were tricked into clicking a link, visiting a site in Firefox that resulted in the installation of two pieces of malware on their computers. And this, as far as we've seen, was limited to Mac infections, which this is really new. We haven't seen a vulnerability like this used to install malware at scale on the Mac since about 2012.
Why do you think that is? Is the Mac now a more, you know, is it a more popular target because it's a more popular device and ecosystem? What do you think people are turning their attention to the Mac?
Yeah, I think Mac is becoming a more popular target because the numbers of Mac users are growing.
Mm.
In addition, the types of people who are using Macs are often, CEOs. They're often, I know a lot of security researchers who use a Mac instead of a Windows machine, even though they might be doing a lot of Windows research. Um, so there are a lot of people that might be high priority targets, um, and that's a good reason, for some of these attacks.
Very, very interesting. Well, we will no doubt be in touch with you when, because as ever with cybersecurity, it's always a case of when, not if, isn't it? So thank you so much for joining us here on the Mac Observer.